The second to last snowfall. The snow hadn't stopped. It fell softly along the edge of the platform, layering the ground like a quiet blanket. Claire stepped out of the train with her suitcase, the dark brown boots pressing gently into the snow, making almost no sound. She paused and looked toward the long, narrow street beyond the station. It had been 5 years since she last returned to this town. The buildings hadn't changed much, but she had, and so had her reason for coming back. She was here for Ethan's funeral. The air was sharp with cold, and flakes melted on her eyelashes. She pulled her scarf higher to cover part of her face, gripping the suitcase handle firmly as she walked. Her steps were slow, not because of the snow, but because she wasn't ready to face everything this place would make her feel. As she passed the old bakery, she instinctively looked through the window. The same wooden door stood there, now with a flyer taped to the glass advertising seasonal treats. Someone new stood behind the counter. The air no longer smelled of cinnamon. The girl who once handed her warm croissants in a paper bag during winter mornings. She was gone, just like so many things. She continued past the post office, the old bookstore, and the small square in front of the town hall. The snow softened every edge and silenced every step. Turning into the alley near the inn, she noticed the bench was still there. The same wooden bench where she and Ethan had their first kiss. Snow covered the seat, the damp wood darkened by time, as if even the bench had held on to its memories. The inn looked just as she remembered: red brick walls, white window frames, and the familiar brass wind chime above the door. She stepped inside, and the doorbell rang with a crisp note that echoed in the quiet lobby. The man behind the counter gave her a gentle nod and handed her a brass key. "Third floor, corner room by the window," he said. Claire took the key. It felt cold in her hand, the chill of the metal seeping into her skin. She climbed the wooden stairs slowly, each step creaking underfoot, as if the old building remembered her footsteps. When she opened the room, she didn't turn on the lights. The snow light from outside filtered through the window, painting the carpet and the edge of the bed in soft gray and white. She placed her suitcase against the wall and sat down at the edge of the bed. Her coat slid off onto the chair behind her. The radiator hummed quietly in the corner, a gentle, steady sound like a heartbeat far away. She leaned back against the pillow and exhaled deeply. It had only been 20 minutes since she stepped off the train, but it felt like she had walked through years of memory just to get here. Outside, the snow was still falling, soft and slow, like a hush that wrapped around everything. Claire closed her eyes and let her head rest against the wall. There was nothing she needed to do right now, nothing to say, just the soft snowlight, the hum of the radiator, and the warmth beginning to gather at her feet. Her body began to loosen, little by little, as if even the stillness had weight, and it was gently pulling her downward. It was okay to be still now. It was okay to rest. Even the world outside was quieting down, waiting for her to simply breathe and let go. The snow still hadn't stopped. Claire stood at the edge of the courtyard outside the chapel, wrapped in a dark coat, her hands buried in her pockets. The snow fell lightly but constantly, as if trying to stretch time, softening the sounds of everything around her. There were maybe a dozen people gathered across the stone paths and snowy ground. No one spoke. The wind whispered now and then, and the sound of boots pressing into snow filled the spaces between. Claire stood a little apart from the others. She wasn't sure if she belonged here anymore. She didn't carry an umbrella. Snowflakes settled gently on her shoulders and melted into faint marks on the wool. In the distance, one umbrella stood out, a large black one. Beneath it, she saw someone she hadn't seen in 5 years. Daniel. He looked thinner than she remembered, his expression quieter, more tired maybe, but the eyes were the same. Their gazes met across the white air and hush of falling snow. Neither moved, neither spoke. He began walking toward her, slowly, carefully, each step pressed softly into the snow, like he didn't want to disturb the silence. When he reached her, he didn't offer the umbrella. The space between them remained dusted with white. He reached into the pocket of his coat and took out an envelope. The paper looked old, its corner bent, the color slightly yellowed from time. He held it out to her without a word. Claire accepted it. Her name was written on the front, in Ethan's handwriting. She knew it instantly. Her fingers trembled slightly. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came. Daniel simply nodded, a small, wordless acknowledgement, and turned to walk back toward the others. The umbrella tilted as he turned, and a soft sheet of snow slipped from its edge, falling like silent rain. Claire looked down at the letter in her hand. The paper felt cold. She didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, she slipped it into the pocket of her coat and lifted her gaze toward the hazy ridge in the distance. The snow had blurred everything, landscape, thought, emotion, until all she could feel was the quiet. She closed her eyes for a moment and let the snow touch her hair, her neck, her breath. It felt like being wrapped in something weightless and soft, like a blanket made of silence. Her shoulders began to ease. Her body felt lighter, as if it could drift gently into the stillness and stay there a while. There was no need to move, no need to speak. Only the hush of falling snow and the slow release of all the thoughts she no longer needed to hold. The room was completely still. Claire closed the door behind her and leaned against the wall, not turning on the light. Snowlight filtered through the half-drawn curtains, casting a pale gray glow across the space. She could hear her own breathing. It felt louder in the quiet. She walked over to the chair and sat down, taking the envelope from her coat pocket. The paper was slightly yellowed, its edges folded with a faint crease pressed in by time. Her eyes rested on the name written across the front. Ethan's handwriting. She recognized it instantly. She placed the letter on her lap and folded her hands, not ready to open it. Not because she feared what was inside, but because she knew. Once she read it, she could no longer pretend the past hadn't happened. Her thoughts drifted back to that snowy day 5 years ago. The suitcase was already by the door, and Daniel had offered to take her to the station. Ethan had stayed quiet, sitting by the window sketching. He was drawing her profile, the lines delicate and focused, as if trying to memorize every detail of her face. She remembered standing at the doorway, her hand on the doorknob, hesitating. Daniel was down the hallway, watching her. Their eyes met. For a moment, she nearly turned around and set the suitcase down. She had thought to herself, if either of them says something, just one word, I might stay. But no one spoke. Not Ethan, not Daniel, not even her. She had convinced herself that leaving would quiet the part of her that felt too much for the wrong person. That walking away would honor the relationship she had and bury the one she never dared name. But none of it worked. She left everything unresolved, including herself. Claire lowered her gaze, gently tracing the crease on the envelope with her finger. What would the letter say? Would it mention the silence between her and Daniel? The things she never confessed? She suspected Ethan had always known. He saw her clearly, more than she ever wanted him to. Outside, the snow continued to fall, softly blurring the outlines of her thoughts. She placed the letter in the bedside drawer, let out a quiet breath, and walked over to the bed. The moment she lay down, her body sank slowly into the warmth of the blankets. The bedding was soft, like a thick layer of snow gently folding around her. She closed her eyes. Her eyelids grew heavy. Her breath settled into a slow, even rhythm. The only sounds in the room were the low hum of the radiator and the snow outside, falling, falling, falling. She knew she would open the letter, eventually, but not now. Now, she just wanted to lie still, say nothing, think nothing, and let the snow cover her like a comforter drawn gently over her shoulders. Her body began to feel lighter, lighter still, until even her thoughts quieted, and the stillness became all that remained. She opened the letter at sunset. The light outside had shifted, soft and golden, like a veil of silk stretched across the snow, casting a warm glow over the bed, the drawer, and her lap. Claire sat quietly in the chair, the envelope resting across her knees. Her fingers gently tore the seal. The paper felt coarse, the kind not usually used for writing something intimate. She unfolded it slowly, 3 neat folds, until the handwriting appeared in front of her eyes. It was Ethan's writing. She would have recognized it anywhere. The letters were slightly lighter than she remembered, and each stroke looked slower, as if written with the last of his strength. "Claire," it began, "if you're reading this, then I'm probably already gone." Her heart tightened. She had already known he was gone, but reading his goodbye in his own hand, that made it real in a way nothing else could. He wrote that he had penned this in the hospital, one afternoon when the light was unusually kind. The doctors had just told him there wasn't much time left. He said he didn't want to burden her with guilt or unfinished expectations. He only wanted to say a few things he never had the courage to speak aloud. I thought time might wear it down, but the closer I got to the end, the more I knew one thing. I've been waiting for you this whole time. There was no poetry in the line, just quiet, steady truth. Yet to Claire, it landed like a small stone in deep water, sending ripples from a place far beneath her thoughts. She set the letter down momentarily and looked out the window. The hills in the distance were tinted with amber. Snow was still falling, but it no longer looked cold. She remembered something Ethan once said, smiling. "When winter's over, let's go to the sea, if you'll still walk beside me." That was the last time he ever spoke of the future. She lowered her eyes again and kept reading. He wrote that he hadn't done anything remarkable in his life, but if there was one thing he never regretted, it was loving her. Even if it hadn't been the kind of love she wanted, he was still thankful she had once existed in his world. Claire folded the letter carefully and placed it gently on her lap. She didn't cry. The stillness inside her was heavier than tears. The snowlight flickered at the window. Time slowed. Everything grew quiet, as though the world had taken a breath and was holding it just for her. She leaned back in the chair, closed her eyes, and let her thoughts settle into the quiet hum of the words he had left behind. There was nothing she needed to say, no response required. She felt her body grow lighter, like snowfall on a blanket, soundless, soft, and slow. The air around her wrapped like a thin mist, brushing against her skin and holding her breath in a calm rhythm. She stopped trying to remember. She stopped resisting the past. She simply let herself stay in that moment, letting the evening hold her gently in place. It felt like the entire world had slowed for her. She let her body loosen, bit by bit, until even the weight of her thoughts began to fade. Her breathing softened, her eyelids sank lower, and it felt as if something was lifting her, gently, only to let her drift down again into the warm and quiet dark. She opened the letter again. The paper trembled lightly in her hands, like a slow, shallow breath. Her fingertips followed the lines of handwriting, tracing each stroke as if touching something already fading. The middle part of the letter was shorter, each sentence spaced out with more silence in between. It felt as if Ethan had paused often, as though the words had taken effort to find. But when her eyes reached that one sentence, she knew it was something he had carried for a long time. "You never really left me," he had written. "I just never had the courage to ask if you ever truly loved my brother." The words didn't land like an accusation. They moved slowly, silently, sinking into her chest like water finding a crack in stone, steady and impossible to stop. Claire's hands trembled slightly. The letter almost slipped from her lap. She didn't keep reading. Instead, she set the paper down gently and turned her gaze toward the window. The sky was already darker. Snow still fell, but she couldn't tell what color it was anymore. Gray? White? Or just quiet? She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She had thought she had hidden it well. She had believed that as long as she never said it aloud, no one would be hurt. Her relationship with Ethan had always been wrapped in softness and silence. She had let herself learn how to rest inside it. But she had never denied that part of her heart, a quiet part, had always been watching Daniel. It wasn't passion. It wasn't impulse. It was something far more difficult to escape, an unspoken understanding that lived between glances, between the spaces that were never named, like a light that stayed on in another room, never reached for, but never extinguished. She remembered Ethan once telling her, "You always look like you're waiting for something, but you never really look at me." She hadn't replied. She had just smiled. That smile, now that she thought about it, had been cruel. She opened her eyes again and looked at the letter. One line near the end had a darker stroke, as if Ethan had hesitated on the word brother. Her shoulders lowered slowly. The tension in her arms released, and something inside her began to loosen. She folded the letter gently and placed it on the nightstand, then turned and lay down on the bed. The blanket wrapped softly around her limbs. The pillow met her head, like afternoon light soaking gently into skin. She didn't force herself to think about the past anymore. She didn't try to answer what had no answer. She simply let herself lie there, like snow landing on old carpet, silent, still, and slowly melting. The room was as quiet as a dream drifting in from far away. Her breath settled, deeper with each cycle. Her eyelids grew heavier. The moment stretched longer, and it felt like time itself had stopped. And for the first time, she allowed herself to release the weight of that one sentence. That sentence had never really left her mind. It wasn't the heaviness of it, or the words themselves. It was how quietly, how slowly it had arrived, like a breeze nudging open a door without making a sound. "If I were gone, would you stay?" That was the last thing Ethan ever said to her. It was a quiet evening. She was packing her things. The train ticket was pulled up on her phone, just 2 hours to go. She'd expected to leave without a scene, without needing to say much at all. But he came home earlier than she'd planned. The sound of the key turning in the lock froze her in place, still standing in the hallway, one hand on the suitcase handle. He didn't question her. He didn't try to stop her. He just stood by the window, watching her from a distance. And then he spoke. No sadness, no anger. He said it as if he were commenting on the weather, detached, quiet, and strange. She hadn't understood it at the time. Something tightened in her chest, and she didn't know what to say. She couldn't tell if he was asking her to stay or offering her a way out. Now she understood. It hadn't been a real question. It had been a way of avoiding the one he truly wanted to ask. What Ethan had meant was, "Are you leaving because of me?" But he hadn't dared say that aloud. He hadn't asked if she still loved him. He hadn't said, "Don't go," because he was afraid of the answer. Rather than stand and take the hit, he made himself the one who might leave first. That sentence had let him keep a sliver of dignity. She remembered standing by the door, her fingers resting on the handle. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket, but she didn't check it. He had already turned around, walking slowly toward the back room. His footsteps were barely audible. Then came the soft click of the door closing, a sound so small, and yet in her memory, it rang louder than anything. She never answered his question. Even now, she didn't know how. She wasn't sure if answering back then would have changed anything. What she did know was that she hadn't meant to hurt him, but she also couldn't offer him a love she didn't fully possess. There had always been a corner of her heart she kept closed, even to herself. She lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling. The lights were off. Only the pale hue of snowlight filtered through the window. Her eyelids began to grow heavy. Her breath slowed and deepened. That sentence replayed in her mind, gently, again and again, like snow falling on a blanket, soundless, building into a quiet weight of regret. She stopped trying to answer. She let the question stay there, untouched, like a drawer she'd never open. Some questions didn't need answers. They just needed time to settle. Her body grew lighter. Her thoughts softened. And in the hush of a snowy night, she began to melt into sleep, wordless and slow. She arrived on the evening train. The sky had already darkened. Snow rested quietly on the roof and tree branches. Not a breeze stirred the air. When the car pulled up in front of the old wooden house, she hesitated for a moment. It had been so long that she wasn't entirely sure if this was still the same place. The small iron bell above the door was still hanging, though its string had been tied into a new knot. That was Daniel's handwriting. The message had simply said, "There are some things here that you should come pick up. The door's unlocked." Her palm was slightly damp when she pushed the door open. It creaked gently. She stepped inside, and the air didn't smell dusty. It carried the faint scent of wood and old sweaters, just like she remembered. Even the corner of the doormat was curled in the same way it had been that winter when she left. She took off her coat and hung it on the same hook. The wooden chair by the wall was still there, though its cushion had clearly worn down. She stood by the door for a while, not moving further. The house was too quiet in a way that felt like it was waiting or remembering. She slowly stepped into the living room. The wooden floor creaked beneath her feet. The sofa was still covered in that same navy checkered cloth. The coffee table was clean, the coasters stacked neatly. In the corner, the heater gave off a soft hum, like a quiet reminder that something still lived here. She sat down, leaning back into the sofa, letting her gaze drift across the room as if searching the air for forgotten pieces of memory. It was a kind of familiarity hard to explain, like a room from a dream she had walked through many times, every corner holding a piece of quiet history. This had once been her weekend place, where Ethan would always ask with a smile, "Feels more like home than your real one, doesn't it?" She used to smile and nod. Now, she was sitting here alone. The air seemed to settle around her. She took a deep breath. The air was cold, but within that cold, there was something soft, almost like time was turning gently backward. She let herself sink deeper into the sofa and closed her eyes. The cushion beneath her was still soft, as if someone had just gotten up moments before. Her shoulders gradually relaxed, and her fingers released the tension they'd been holding. She thought, maybe that's how memory works. When you return to the space where it was made, it quietly welcomes you back. No questions, no demands, just a silent kind of recognition. She sat there quietly, letting the images rise and fall inside her without effort, without need to explain. She began to feel her body growing lighter, as if the furniture itself was sinking into the floor and lifting her at the same time. The air wrapped around her like cotton, layered and quiet. There were no ticking clocks, no buzzing phones, only stillness and warmth, and the steady slowing of her thoughts. Her breathing deepened. Her eyelids grew heavy. It was like stepping into a dream within memory, one where nothing would wake her, where no regrets could follow, only snow falling gently, and time moving quietly on. She hadn't expected the piano to still be in the same place. It stood quietly against the wall, its wooden frame slightly faded. The lid was closed, a cloth laid over it, and in one corner rested a small black and white photo of her and Ethan standing by the bridge one winter. It had been taken before they were together and before they drifted apart. She stepped closer and lifted the cloth with her fingertips. Dust shimmered faintly underneath, but the grain of the wood was still visible. She took a slow breath and gently lifted the lid. The sound was barely audible, like a memory long asleep beginning to wake. There, lying just above the keys, was a folded piece of paper. She froze, then slowly picked it up. It was her own handwriting. One glance was all it took. This was something she had written 5 years ago. She'd assumed it had been thrown away long ago, forgotten or lost in time. But here it was, kept exactly where she had left it, as if someone had been waiting for her to come back and find it. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded the paper. The ink had faded a bit, but the words were still clear. "If one day I'm brave enough, I'll come back." She could hardly remember why she had written that sentence. At the time, she had been preparing to leave, unable to say the things she really felt. Writing those words had been a kind of self-consolation, a quiet excuse. She never expected anyone to find them. It had been a private whisper to herself. And yet, it had remained here all along. She sat down on the bench, still holding the note. Light from the window fell gently across the keys. A few of the white ones gleamed faintly, as if reminding her that some pieces of the past had never truly disappeared. They'd simply waited, hidden in the folds of time. Lowering her gaze, she let out a quiet sigh. She couldn't help wondering who had found the note and gently placed it back. Daniel? Ethan? Maybe they had always known that those words weren't meant for just anyone. Her shoulders sank, and she let her body settle into the familiar curve of the bench. The room was utterly silent, except for the whisper of the note in her hand, still echoing something unspoken. Her heartbeat slowed. Her gaze softened. The tension she'd carried began to melt away, one thread at a time. She leaned against the piano and closed her eyes. Her breathing was light, almost inaudible. The note rested gently between her fingers, like a quiet thread connecting her to a version of herself she had almost forgotten. That sentence fell into her heart like snow, silent, weightless, letting her slowly unwind, as if drifting into a dream that had no end. She was still sitting at the piano, the note spread out on her lap, her fingertips pressing lightly on the words. From outside the room came the sound of footsteps, steady, quiet, deliberate. She didn't turn around. She simply asked, "Do you remember this note?" Daniel walked into the living room and set a wooden box down on the coffee table. Inside were the things she'd come to retrieve: a few books, an old scarf, a sketchbook she had once left behind. He stood for a while before speaking, his voice unhurried. "I remember. The day Ethan found it, I was with him. He lifted the piano lid, read the words, and just sat there. He didn't speak, didn't ask. He just looked at it for a long time. Then he put it back, closed the lid." She turned to look at him. His face was calm, but not empty. There was something familiar in the way he carried the silence, like a feeling he had grown used to holding. "I knew the note wasn't meant for me," he said quietly. She frowned slightly, but before she could speak, he continued, "I knew you felt something for me. I wasn't blind, but you never said it, and you never chose me. You left this note, but you didn't leave a name. You didn't dare write one, maybe because you hadn't figured it out yourself." Her fingers twitched. The paper on her lap trembled. What he said was true. She hadn't left because she didn't care, but because she cared too much. She couldn't admit it then, couldn't face what that meant. Daniel paused, then added the line that pressed into her chest like ice. "I wanted to believe the note was for me, but you left without a word. So I told myself it wasn't. I didn't feel like I had the right to claim it." His voice dropped, soft as snow settling on the floor. "Ethan never asked either. Maybe deep down he knew, but he would rather believe he was the one you remembered." That sentence drifted through the room like fog. No accusations, no anger, only a long-delayed truth, offered without demand. She felt something in her chest quietly begin to break apart. It made no sound. It was just a slow release. Daniel said nothing more. He simply reached for the cup she'd set aside earlier and slid it gently back toward her. The movement was soft, as if he was afraid to disturb something fragile that had already started to crack. She lowered her eyes, looking at the note, then at the cup. Her hands were trembling, just slightly. Her breathing had slowed without her noticing. She leaned back into the chair and closed her eyes. Outside, the snow brushed softly against the glass, making the gentlest sound. She felt herself slowly loosening, no longer holding on, no longer trying to run. The weight of that note no longer belonged to anyone. It simply settled into time itself, without burden and without the need for an answer. At night, the snow began to fall again. Claire stepped out of the inn with nothing in her hands. She pulled her scarf a little tighter and followed a familiar path toward the edge of town. The streetlights were dim, and a soft layer of snow had already settled under the eaves. Her footsteps made a delicate sound against the ground, so light it was as if even the air didn't dare make a noise. She hadn't planned to go anywhere in particular. Her feet simply moved, almost unconsciously, in the direction of the old bridge. It was a wooden bridge, stretching across a frozen river, its iron railings rusted with time. 5 years ago, just before she left, she had stood on that very bridge, looking back one last time before walking away. Back then, Ethan would often hold her hand as they crossed slowly together. He once joked, "This bridge is too old. We have to walk carefully or we'll break it." Then he'd turn and ask, "Still willing to walk with me?" She had heard that line many times, yet somehow it never faded. The sound of his voice, the tilt of his head, those things clung to her memory like nails driven into wood. Now, all she had to do was walk this path, and the words would come flooding back. Claire stopped at the entrance to the bridge, looking down at the snow-covered planks. When she stepped onto them, they creaked softly beneath her boots, as if her footsteps were disturbing something that had been sleeping. She looked up. The sky was a dull gray, snow falling soundlessly without direction, like a dream that had no clear ending. There was little wind, but the air was so cold that her breathing slowed, and her eyes began to sting. At the far end of the bridge stood an old wooden bench, one of the few original things in town that hadn't been replaced. Claire remembered a time when she and Ethan had fought. He had walked off quickly, and she had chased after him, breathless, finally collapsing onto that bench and refusing to move. He hadn't said a word. He had simply taken her hand and slipped it into the pocket of his coat. At the time, she thought it was just a reflex, but now she wondered if that had been the limit of what Ethan could express. She walked toward the bench slowly, as if stepping into a painting already buried in snow. A thin layer had gathered on the seat. She didn't brush it off. Instead, she sat down and let her body sink into the curve of the wood. The air was crisp and scentless, carrying only the soft sound of snowflakes landing on her scarf, gentle and steady. She didn't look back. She kept her eyes on the far end of the bridge, as if someone might appear from there. Or maybe she was only waiting for a moment in time to come back to her. She no longer tried to explain any of it. There were no answers now, and none were needed. She simply let her feet relax, her shoulders drop, and allowed the night to gather around her like a blanket. Her breathing slowed. Her eyes grew heavy. Her body began to ease into a state somewhere between floating and stillness. Time no longer pushed her forward. Instead, it gently, slowly, settled her into a moment with no sound. She sat quietly, letting the snow gather on her coat, her knees, her hair. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't rushing. She was just there. Claire thought, maybe rain wakes people up, but snow helps you fall still. It didn't rush, didn't explain. It simply fell, one quiet flake at a time, reminding her, in the gentlest way, that it was okay to slow down. The bench was cold, the dampness of the wood seeping into her back, but Claire didn't move. She sat quietly, letting her body slowly adjust to the chill in the air. The wind drifted gently across the bridge, and the snow fell one flake at a time, landing softly on her scarf and hair, as if someone were whispering near her ear. She pulled the letter from her coat pocket, Ethan's letter. She didn't know why she wanted to read it again. She had already read it back at the inn. Maybe it was the bridge, or the snow, or maybe it was simply that she had finally returned to the place he had walked with her so many times. She unfolded the paper across her lap. Under the snow-filtered light, The page reflected a faint glow. The handwriting rested there quietly, each stroke unmistakably Ethan's. She knew the way he wrote, slow, light, as if he paused before every word. She skipped past the parts she already remembered too well: the hospital, the room, the little time he had left. Then her eyes settled again on one line. I used to think time would soften everything, but the closer I came to the end, the more I knew I was always waiting for you. She thought the tears had already passed, that her emotions had settled. But reading that line a second time, the pain she thought had dulled slowly crept in, like melted snow seeping into her skin, expanding through her chest inch by inch. She closed her eyes, her fingertip resting against the ink. Around her, the sound of snow falling was soft and slow, like those words repeating themselves in silence, sinking deeper and deeper into her heart. She remembered winters long ago, Ethan walking beside her on this very bridge, saying things that didn't mean much, just to make her laugh. Back then, she thought he was too quiet, not the type to say anything romantic. But now she saw it clearly. He had already said everything. She just hadn't understood. A single tear slipped from the corner of her eye, then another, until the stillness cracked open like ice under pressure. Quiet, but complete. She didn't wipe them away. She let them fall, the way snow falls, gently, silently, without explanation. Her shoulders relaxed. She leaned back into the bench, her whole body sinking into the space between memory and snow. That one line echoed again in her mind. I was always waiting for you. She didn't speak it aloud, but in her heart, she answered, I know. I really do. Her breathing grew lighter, like her body was finally releasing a weight it had carried far too long. In that moment, there was no before or after, no sound, only her and the letter, and the words that had finally been heard, settling quietly into the snow. Claire was still sitting on the old bench, the letter now folded and resting quietly in her hands. The snow hadn't stopped, but her breathing had grown calm again. The tears she'd shed felt like they had come from somewhere deep inside, and now there was only a trace of warmth left at the corners of her eyes. She looked ahead at the snow-covered bridge and felt as if time had started moving again, not to push her forward, but to remind her that she was still here, and something was still unfinished. She whispered, barely knowing whether she'd spoken aloud or only mouthed the words in her heart. I came back, but you're not here. A soft wind passed by just then, as if carrying the words away for her. She looked down and noticed how her fingers had gone slightly numb, but she didn't try to move them. All this time, she had thought she returned to sort through the past. She believed she'd come back simply to say goodbye to old memories. But now she understood. What she truly wanted to hold on to wasn't the past itself. It was the feeling of having been remembered, of having been waited for. She wasn't longing for the days that had already passed. She was longing for the version of herself who had once been silently held in someone's heart, who had been forgiven even in absence. That girl, flawed and hesitant, had still been someone Ethan waited for. And now, she realized, the snow wasn't here to bury anything. It was here to gently reveal something she hadn't yet been ready to see. It wasn't just about love, or whether she had made the right choice. It was about what had brought her back, and what made her want to stay. Deep down, she had been searching for one answer. Did she still deserve to begin again? She stood slowly. The snow under her feet gave a soft crunch. She didn't walk away right away. Instead, she stood at the center of the bridge for a while. The snowfall had lightened. In the distance, a single lamp glowed through the white haze, casting a path of warm light across the middle of the bridge, almost as if the road had been left there just for her. She knew now. It wasn't over. Not the grief, not the memories, and not her part in this story. Something between her and all of it was still unfolding. Something she hadn't fully let go of. Something she hadn't yet fully understood. She closed her eyes, letting the wind brush through her hair, letting the snow gather on her lashes. The moment was as quiet as deep water. She felt her entire body being gently held by the air itself, as if time was wrapping around her, softly and slowly, asking for nothing, only inviting her to rest. The lakeside bar was still there. It looked even quieter than she remembered. The light above the door glowed a soft amber, dim enough to let people sit inside and say things that didn't need to be clearly heard. Claire pushed the door open. The first thing she saw was the wall by the entrance, still covered in old, yellowed posters. One of them, curled at the corners, was from 5 years ago. The window side table in the far corner was empty. She chose that one, the same spot Ethan used to prefer. Outside the glass, the lake sat still beneath the snow. When the flakes fell, they covered the surface so quietly it almost looked like something from a painting. Daniel walked in a few minutes later, carrying a thermos. He hadn't brought any alcohol, just 2 white porcelain cups and a warm tea he'd prepared himself. He sat across from her and opened the lid. The scent that rose was soft, like honey, or like something you'd drink in cold weather that warmed you from the inside out. "I remember you never could really drink," he said, pouring the tea. "But you always said you wanted to try, just a little. Then you'd take one sip and make a face." Claire let out a quiet laugh. "I always thought I'd get used to it, but I never did." They didn't clink cups. They didn't say anything sentimental. They just sat and drank their tea. There was a slow rhythm to the moment, as if both had silently agreed. This time, they didn't need to disturb anything. Just being there was enough. This was where she and Ethan had their last argument. That night, they'd each had a little to drink. Not much, but just enough to make their words blunt and their silences sharp. The argument wasn't loud. There were no tears, just a quiet kind of tension where neither wanted to yield. Ethan walked out without turning back. She stayed, ordered a whiskey she never touched, and didn't leave until the bar closed. Sitting here now, she felt no anger, no regret, only something deeper, a kind of release. Not the kind that comes from forgiveness, but the kind that comes from simply being able to return without needing to ask why. Outside, the snow continued to fall, settling over the lake in a soft, white layer. Claire wrapped her fingers around the cup. Her grip loosened. The warmth seeped through the porcelain into her hands. She felt as if the entire night was gently wrapping around her, asking nothing in return. She didn't need to plan what came next. She didn't need to speak. She leaned back in her chair and let out a slow breath. Her breathing grew deeper, steadier, like her whole body was slowly sinking into this quiet, like the night would stretch out endlessly ahead of her, and for once, she was safe to stay in it. The tea had gone cold in the cup, but Claire still held it in her hands. The warmth had faded, but the feeling of holding something steady remained, like a quiet kind of anchor. In that place, in that moment, she didn't have to pretend she had already let go. Outside, the snow kept falling. The music in the bar played faintly, as if it came from behind a wall. Daniel sat across from her without speaking, without pressing. He simply stayed, letting the silence stretch gently between them, just like he always had. Claire looked down at her cup. Her voice came out soft, like something she was still unsure belonged out loud. I never really thought you carried that much inside. I used to think I was just leaving a place, but now I realize maybe I left something in you too. She looked up at him. Do you blame me? Daniel didn't answer right away. He held her gaze, as if giving the question time to settle. Then he nodded slightly. I did. For a while. He paused, then added, but it wasn't your fault. He offered a small smile, short-lived but free of bitterness. I used to think that if I stayed close enough, long enough, one day you'd turn around and see me. I thought if I waited, I'd eventually become your choice. He let the sentence hang for a moment, not for drama, but because some truths don't land easily. I wanted so badly to be the one you chose. It took me a long time to understand. Some things don't happen just because you try hard enough. Claire didn't look away. She didn't interrupt. There was something about this moment, something about the simplicity of it, that allowed all the old, tangled feelings to rise to the surface without fear. I'm sorry, she said, her voice steady now. I never really looked at your feelings for what they were. Daniel shook his head gently. I always knew I wasn't the one, but even knowing that, I still hoped. There was no heaviness in his tone, just a kind of softness, like a breeze across the table that didn't stir anything, only passed through. Claire didn't reply. She simply lifted her cup and took a sip. The tea was cold, but oddly comforting, like something that no longer had to be sweet to be accepted. She leaned back in her chair, letting her breath stretch longer, deeper. Outside, the snow kept falling, on the lake, on everything they had never said. The story between them didn't need a conclusion. It had found its stillness, and that was enough. The snow had paused for a while outside the bar, as if the entire night had decided to be still. Claire and Daniel walked together down to the lake, their boots pressed deep into the snow, leaving behind a slow trail of footprints. The sound beneath each step was soft, like memories slowly fading with every move forward. The lake was frozen now, covered in a thin layer of pale frost. The edges were uneven, with faint ripples frozen mid-curve. The two of them didn't speak much. They simply walked side by side, breathing quietly in the cold. Moonlight settled across the surface of the ice, chilled, but strangely gentle. Claire reached into her bag and pulled out the letter. She had read it so many times by now. The folds had softened, the paper worn, as if time itself had been smoothing it down. She stood near the edge of the lake, holding the letter in both hands. She had thought she might read it one more time, but in the end, she only looked at it, saying nothing. A breeze came from the side. Not strong, but clear and certain. She let go. The paper lifted from her hands, spinning once in the air before it gently landed on the surface of the ice. It didn't stop right away. It glided slowly across the frozen lake, drifting farther until it came to rest not far from the shore. She didn't move to chase it, didn't try to take it back. She just stood there, watching as the letter stayed where it was, resting quietly beneath the snow that had begun to fall again, light and soft, covering it like it had never been there at all. Daniel said nothing. He didn't ask why. He only stood beside her, looking out over the lake as the wind settled and the silence returned. The snow continued to fall gently, touching the surface of the ice, landing on her shoulders like a soft blanket marking the end of something. "Then let it stay for spring," Claire whispered. She didn't know if she was speaking to Ethan or to herself. She wasn't hoping for another snowfall, nor expecting anyone to find the letter. She only knew that some things are important when they're spoken, and just as important when it's time to let them go. That night felt like the end of a long road. No sign, no gate, just wind, snow, and a frozen lake, quietly remembering that they had once been here. Claire drew in a slow breath. Her chest rose and fell gently. She closed her eyes and let her whole body begin to loosen, as if time itself was dissolving around her, drifting with the wind. There was nothing left to think about, nothing she needed to carry anymore. Morning light slipped through the edge of the curtains, drawing a pale diagonal across the floor. The snow had stopped. The cold remained, but without the heaviness of the night. It felt as though the air had been gently wiped clean. Claire sat at the edge of the bed, still wrapped in a blanket, not yet ready to get up. She looked out the window at the thin layer of snow clinging to the rooftops. It hadn't melted all at once. Instead, it had pulled back slowly, leaving behind scattered white patches that looked like they were reluctant to leave. She reached over and opened the window. A rush of cold air swept in, making her inhale sharply. The air carried a faint, unfamiliar scent, light, but somehow familiar. She closed her eyes and took a deeper breath. It was a mixture of sunlight, damp earth, and fabric, like the scent of Ethan's scarf from a winter long ago, lingering from a quiet embrace. She didn't cry. She didn't feel overwhelmed. She simply let that scent settle into her chest, into her memory, where it spoke more honestly than words ever could. Her suitcase had already been packed the night before. It sat in the corner, zipped neatly, looking as if it were waiting to be lifted, or maybe waiting to be left behind. Claire glanced at it, but didn't move just yet. The room was quiet. Only distant sounds of passing cars and the faint creak of the wooden floorboards shifting with the temperature reminded her she was not in a dream. But those sounds didn't interrupt anything. If anything, they grounded her. She wasn't in the past. She wasn't in a memory. She was here. She walked over to the mirror and gently smoothed back her hair. She didn't fix much, but her reflection seemed a little clearer than it had been in recent days. Maybe she had slept a little better. Or maybe she no longer needed to try so hard to remember anything. Outside, the light continued to brighten, spreading across the carpet in a soft, golden layer. She stood by the window and let the sunlight touch her face. It wasn't intense, but it was enough to make her pause, as if telling her body, "You can be a little lighter now." She took a deep breath in, then let it out slowly. Something inside her had been released, quietly, like a knot untying. Nothing dramatic had happened, but her body knew. She was ready. The station looked just the same, worn but clean. The timetable on the wall had been updated, but the scuff marks along the base of the benches hadn't changed. Claire rolled her suitcase onto the platform, and a quiet sense of calm settled over her. It wasn't lightness or excitement. It was something steadier, like finally being able to breathe again. She stood near the edge of the platform, looking out over the tracks stretching into the distance. Snow still covered both sides, but the rails had been cleared by passing trains, two black lines cutting sharply through the white. The air was cold but not biting. It woke her up in a good way. Setting her suitcase down beside her, she stood tall. She didn't check the time. She didn't reach for her phone. She just stood there, letting the wind brush her face. The distant sound of a station announcement drifted through the air, muffled and soft, but real. Everything around her was real now, not memory, not imagination. The sound of an approaching train reached her. At first, it was just a low vibration, like someone stepping quietly across a snowy field. Claire didn't move. She simply raised her head and watched as the train slowly emerged from the mist, its headlights cutting a gentle line through the fog. She thought of all the other times she'd taken trains, how she used to mentally run through destinations, items packed, next steps, goals, but not this time. She wasn't thinking about where she was going or why. There was no need to chase meaning anymore. Instead, she said quietly to herself, "Wherever I go, I'll remember you." It wasn't a goodbye. It was a promise. She wasn't leaving anything behind, and she wasn't denying the past. She was folding it carefully into her luggage, placing it where it belonged, somewhere that wouldn't take up too much space, but would always stay with her. The train pulled in. The doors opened with a soft sound. Claire didn't board right away. She took a slow, deep breath, letting the cold air fill her chest one more time. Then she reached for her suitcase and took a step forward. Snow had started falling again, lightly, gently, settling along the edge of the platform. She didn't look back. The train pulled away so quietly, it felt like nothing more than a gentle tremble beneath her feet, like wind brushing across the surface of a lake. Claire found a seat by the window, placed her suitcase beside her, and leaned back into the chair, her hands gently resting in her lap. Outside, the snowy landscape flowed past in silence, like a sketch slowly unfolding. Distant trees were draped in white, rooftops coated in clean, untouched snow. The roads were empty, except for a few lone footprints disappearing into the white. A beam of sunlight slipped through the clouds and lit up an open field, as if someone had once waited there, through a long, quiet winter. She didn't think about where the next stop would be. She didn't look back. She simply watched as the world outside slowly receded. Her breathing grew deeper, slower, as if her whole body was beginning to soften with the rhythm of the train. It wasn't fatigue. It was a quiet readiness. She closed her eyes. What came to mind wasn't a sentence. It wasn't anyone's face. It was an image. The bridge where the snow had fallen, the letter lifting gently into the air, then settling on the frozen lake, light enough to leave no trace. If this was truly the last snowfall of the year, then the one before, it must have been the one he left for her. As that thought drifted through her, something soft began to wrap around her, like a blanket made of memory. She no longer fought to stay awake. She no longer feared letting go. Time seemed to slow. Her breath turned lighter. Even her shoulders loosened, as if the journey had no end and needed no destination. She was simply moving forward, quietly, steadily. The carriage was almost silent, save for the low, steady rhythm of train wheels on the track, like a lullaby with no melody, humming softly in the background. Claire leaned against the window, eyes closed, her lips slightly parted in rest, as if drifting into a dream long, slow, and kind.